Picture a man who dictates the laws of the known world, yet walks the sunlit streets of Rome without a single armed guard. He wears a plain wool toga, hosts ordinary dinner parties, and violently rejects the title of a king. This display of modesty was entirely calculated. The Roman populace had just survived 20 years of relentless civil war. The streets had run with blood, and the old democratic institutions were exhausted, leaving a fractured society desperate for physical stability. Out of that chaos emerged the victor, a man originally named Octavian, but soon to be known as Augustus. He stood alone at the top, commanding the absolute loyalty of 44 veteran legions. He had conquered his enemies by force, but brute force is fragile. His actual genius lay in recognizing that to hold on to this power, he had to become a master of political deception. For centuries, the Roman Republic had defined itself by a deep, almost religious hatred of monarchs. The very word king was political poison. Augustus had learned this lesson firsthand from his adopted father, Julius Caesar. Caesar had assumed the posture of a monarch, openly flaunting his permanent dictatorship. In response, the Senate slaughtered him on the floor of their own assembly. This left Augustus in a terrifying bind. If he openly claimed the throne, another group of senators with daggers would inevitably find him. But if he gave up his army and stepped down, the fragile peace would collapse right back into civil war. To survive, he had to engineer a system no one had ever seen before. He needed absolute autocracy, but it had to masquerade perfectly as a functioning republic. His solution began with a spectacular piece of political theater. Augustus stood before the Senate, read a carefully studied speech, and solemnly offered to resign. He declared that he was restoring the republic to the people and wished only to live as a private citizen. The Senate, which was heavily seated with his loyalists, reacted with orchestrated panic. They unanimously refused to accept his resignation, begging him to stay and protect the state he had saved. Feigning reluctance, after a decent show of resistance, the crafty tyrant submitted to their pleas. He agreed to maintain his military command and oversight, but ostensibly only for a temporary period of 10 years. This comedy of resignation became a routine. By continually threatening to step down at the end of each term, he forced the Senate to perpetually demand that he remain their master. With his authority secured, he began to dismantle the republic without breaking a single law. He left the ancient political structures completely intact on the outside, while carefully extracting all their power from the inside. To the average citizen, the government seemed perfectly normal. Rome continued to hold annual elections, voting in consuls to lead the state and tribunes to represent the common people. But behind the scenes, the Senate granted Augustus the permanent power of a tribune, giving him absolute veto power. Simultaneously, they handed him the powers of a consul for life, granting direct control over finances and the legions. He absorbed the executive, legislative, and military functions of the state into his own hands. But he insisted on being called princeps, merely the first citizen. By hiding his tyranny behind the masks of traditional offices, he made his rule constitutionally impossible to challenge. Still, one glaring problem remained. A man who permanently commands all the armies looks suspiciously like a military dictator. Augustus needed a way to control the troops while appearing to share the empire. So he divided the map. He graciously handed the Senate control over the peaceful, wealthy, and secure territories, like Greece and North Africa. In return, he claimed the heavy burden of managing the chaotic, untamed frontiers, areas like Gaul and Syria, where rebellion was a constant threat. This map of the Roman Empire reveals the trap. Claiming the dangerous border provinces gave Augustus the only locations where active legions were legally permitted. The Senate governed the inner empire with mere clerks, while Augustus held an absolute monopoly on physical force. If the senators ever wanted to rebel against his velvet cage, they would have to do it without a single soldier to back them up. And the common people let it happen. The wealthy Romans embraced the philosophy of ease, and the working class, exhausted by decades of bloodshed, willingly traded their tumultuous political freedom for physical security. Augustus flooded the capital with reliable grain shipments from Egypt and distracted the masses with lavish public entertainments. They demanded only bread and circuses, and his liberal hand provided both. The Senate House, once the beating heart of a republic, became a hollow shell. Senators still held meetings and delivered eloquent speeches, but they only debated matters that the emperor expressly allowed them to discuss. Because their immediate material desires were met, and because the comforting rituals of their ancestors were still performed, the citizens never felt the urge to riot over a democracy that no longer existed. Augustus pulled off one of the greatest political illusions in history. He instituted an absolute, unchallengeable monarchy, perfectly disguised by the hollowed-out forms of a commonwealth. We often expect the end of liberty to arrive with a violent coup or a warlord demanding submission. Augustus proved you don't need to burn the institutions down. You just have to staff them with people who answer only to you. It was a system so stable, so brilliantly crafted, that his successors maintained this exact optical illusion to rule the Roman world for centuries. The death of a republic rarely happens by force. It happens quietly. It happens when the populace willingly surrenders their liberty to the autocrat pulling the strings behind a democratic facade. Historian Edward Gibbon argued the period from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus was the most happy and prosperous in human history. But beneath the pristine marble temples and the soaring rhetoric of the Senate, the citizens of this golden age were living under absolute military rule. The architects of this system remembered exactly what happened to Julius Caesar. Caesar made the fatal error of demanding the title of king, openly displaying his absolute power. The Romans, who revered the memory of their free republic, assassinated him for the offense. His successor, Augustus, learned from that bloodletting. He recognized a vital psychological truth. People are governed by names, not realities. They will accept submission as long as they are respectfully assured they are still free. So Augustus built an architecture of illusion. He gathered all the terrifying powers of a dictator, but wore the humble title of first citizen. He maintained the Senate, the consuls, and the tribunes, deliberately hollowing out their authority while keeping the ceremonial facade entirely intact. A fiercely proud society, raised on stories of liberty, cheerfully embraced their own subjugation. All it took was a tyrant polite enough to let them keep their old traditions. Officially, power flowed downward from the Roman Senate, creating a comforting image of civil liberty. But the hidden mechanism bypassed them entirely. The emperor held an absolute monopoly on military force. The frontier legions and elite Praetorian Guard answered exclusively to one man. These heavily armed men, like the Praetorian Guards carved into this relief, were the actual arbiters of Roman politics. The Senate could deliberate, but the military dictated the outcome. This setup carried a terrifying vulnerability. Every time an emperor died, the polite illusion dissolved. The throne sat empty, and the soldiers realized their own immense leverage. They could demand massive cash bonuses or back rival generals, dragging the entire empire into civil war. The celebrated Roman peace was essentially an ongoing hostage situation. The civilian population's safety relied entirely on the emperor's ability to bribe and discipline the troops. To manage this, emperors from Nerva to Hadrian abandoned the biological lottery. They legally adopted proven commanders as heirs. Successors like Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius became co-emperors early. When the senior died, no power vacuum existed. The military was already loyal. Marcus Aurelius represented the ultimate perfection of this design. Here was a man holding absolute dictatorial control, yet he voluntarily bound himself to the strict morality of Stoic philosophy and deferred to the rule of law. He despised warfare as a disgrace to human nature. Yet he spent 8 grueling winter campaigns living in freezing camps along the Danube River, deploying his absolute power to protect the civilians back home. His personal restraint and respect for civil administration were so convincing that the Romans truly felt they were living in a restored republic. But the stability of millions depended exclusively on the character, temper, and health of whoever happened to wear the purple. The tragedy of the Augustan system lay in its structure. The Senate and the laws were purely theatrical props. They provided a beautiful stage for a virtuous emperor to perform his duties, but they possessed zero capacity to block the actions of a vicious one. When the adoptive chain finally broke, the citizens faced a brutal reality. Under cruel leaders like Nero or Domitian, the mask of the Republic was torn away, and the vast military apparatus was turned inward against the Roman people. A subject in the Persian Empire grew up expecting absolute rule. Their history offered no other model. But the Romans were raised reading the speeches of Cicero and studying the philosophies of Grecian liberty. That education transformed their subjugation into a unique form of psychological torture. They were fully aware of the dignity of their freeborn ancestors, yet they found themselves trapped in a state of abject slavery, forced to applaud the tyrants who murdered them, and there was nowhere to run. Because the empire consumed the entire known world, a political exile sent to a barren rock or the frozen banks of the Danube was still trapped. To resist was fatal, and the oceans and barbarian frontiers formed the walls of a planetary prison. A benevolent dictator remains, by definition, a dictator. Peace generated by the sheer luck of a good leader's personality is a fragile illusion. True liberty requires more than the temporary virtue of one person.